In 1983, a group of scientists got together with the proposition of something nearly impossible. They believed that the five senses clouded our awareness of eternity, and without them, a human could actually establish contact with God by thought. An elderly man who claimed to have nothing left to live for was the only test subject to volunteer. To purge him of all his senses, the scientist performs a very complex operation in which every sense nerve connection to the brain was surgically severed. Although the test subject retained all muscular function, he could not see, hear, taste, smell, or feel. With no possible way to communicate or even sense the outside world, he was alone with only his thoughts. Two days later, the man cried out that he could hear his dead wife speaking to him, and even more, he could communicate back. The scientists were intrigued, but were not convinced, until the subject started to name off dead relatives of the scientists. He repeated personal information to the scientists that only their dead spouses and parents would have known. At this point, a sizable portion of scientists left the study. After a week of conversing with the deceased through his thoughts, the subject became distressed, saying the voices were overwhelming him, bombarding him at every single turn, saying that there were hundreds of voices screaming at him that refused to leave him alone. He frequently threw himself against the wall, trying to at least stop the pain or gain response. He begged the scientist for a sedation, as he would escape that by going to sleep. This seemed to work for a few days, until he became extremely paranoid and had night terrors. The subject started to have what he would say the voices would manifest themselves in his sleep. A mere day later, the subject began to scream, to claw at his own non-functional eyes, hoping to sense something, anything. The hysterical subject, with the voices in his head, deafening and hostile, speaking of a land that we don't even know, about hell, the torments, the end of the world. At one point he yelled, "No heaven, no forgiveness," for 5 hours straight. He constantly begged to be killed, but the scientists were convinced that he was close to establishing contact with God. The next day, the subject could no longer form coherent sentences, seemingly mad. He stated to bite off chunks of flesh from his hand. The scientists rushed into the test lab and restrained him to the table so he could not kill himself. After a few hours of being tied down, the subject halted his struggling and screaming. He stared blankly at the ceiling as teardrops started to silently streak across his face. For 2 weeks, the subject had been mentally dehydrated due to the constant crying. Eventually, he turned his head, and despite his blindness, made focused eye contact with the scientist for the first time in the study. He's whispered, "I have spoken with God, and he has abandoned us." With that, his vitals stopped. There was no apparent cause of death. The test was unconcluded.